The officer shoved him through the glass door of the lobby, and the old man stumbled into the marble floor on both knees. Nobody moved. 17 people stood in the atrium of the Caldwell Grand Hotel that Tuesday morning. Guests, bellhops, a woman with a stroller, and not one of them moved. They watched the way people watch something they don't believe is happening, even while it's happening right in front of them. The man on the floor was named Otis Beauford. He was 63 years old. He had a gray cardigan with 2 missing buttons, reading glasses tucked into the breast pocket, and a brown paper bag under one arm that had split open when he fell, spilling a styrofoam cup of coffee and a folded newspaper across the polished floor. He said quietly, "I just need to get up." The officer, a younger man, broad-shouldered, with a name tag that read Del Vecchio, looked down at him the way you look at something you're deciding whether to step over. "Sir," Del Vecchio said, "you were told to leave this property." "I wasn't told anything," Otis said. He pressed one palm flat against the marble and tried to push himself up. His left knee had been replaced 8 months ago. The right one was scheduled for the same procedure in April. He made a sound when he moved that was quiet and controlled, the kind of sound a man makes when he's decided. Pain is not going to be the thing that wins. "You were loitering outside the entrance for 20 minutes, Del Vecchio said. "I was waiting," Otis said. "There's a difference." "Waiting for what?" Otis got himself up. It took longer than it should have. When he was standing, he straightened the cardigan, picked up the newspaper from the floor, and looked at the officer with the particular steadiness of someone who has been patient for a very long time. "Waiting for my meeting," he said. Del Vecchio had been with the Caldwell Grand's contracted security firm for 11 months. Before that, he'd worked a stint at a mall in Marietta, and before that, a parking structure in Buckhead. He was 26. He was good at looking like authority, which is a different thing from having it, though at 26 that distinction is easy to miss. He had been told by the front desk manager on duty that there was a suspicious individual outside the main entrance. That was the phrase used. Suspicious individual. When Del Vecchio stepped outside and saw Otis Beauford, older black man, worn clothes, paper bag, standing near the revolving door reading a newspaper, he had made a decision before asking a single question. That was the part nobody talked about later, how fast the decision got made. He'd approached Otis and told him this was private property. Otis had said he understood, but that he had a meeting inside at 9 o'clock and was waiting for it to be time. Del Vecchio had asked him who the meeting was with. Otis had said that was a private matter. Del Vecchio had told him private matters didn't give him the right to stand outside a luxury hotel looking like he was casing the place. That was the phrase he used, casing the place. Otis had looked at him for a long moment. Then he'd said, "Young man, I've been in this city longer than you've been alive." Del Vecchio had told him to move along. Otis had said, "I'm not moving along, I have a meeting." And that was when Del Vecchio had taken him by the arm. Inside the lobby, a woman at the front desk named Sandra Pruitt had watched the whole thing through the glass. She was 22, 6 weeks into the job, and she was the one who had called security in the first place. Because her supervisor, a man named Jeffrey, had pointed at the figure outside and said, "Can you get someone to handle that?" And Sandra had not known how to say she wasn't sure there was anything to handle. She watched Otis Beauford get pushed through the door and go down on the marble floor, and she felt something cold settle in her stomach. She picked up the phone, then she put it down, then she picked it up again. She didn't know who to call. She was 6 weeks in. Jeffrey had gone to the back office. The guests in the atrium were watching. Del Vecchio was standing over the old man, telling him he needed to leave immediately, or the next call would be to Atlanta PD, and the old man was saying, in a voice that was steady in a way that made Sandra's chest ache, "I am not leaving. I have a meeting at 9 o'clock. "Meeting with who?" Del Vecchio said again. Otis bent down, picked up his styrofoam cup. The lid had stayed on. He looked at it, then at the officer. "With the general manager of this hotel," he said. Del Vecchio almost laughed. "The general manager? Yes. And what would you be meeting the general manager about?" Otis said, "That's between me and him." There was a pause. "I'm going to need you to come with me," Delvecchio said. "Until we can sort this out, I'm not going anywhere with you," Otis said. "I'm going to stand right here and in." He checked his watch, a scratched but clean Seiko that had been his father's. "6 minutes. I'm going to walk to the conference room on the second floor, and I'm going to have my meeting." "Sir, I'd like you to call the general manager," Otis said. "If he tells me to leave, I'll leave. But I think you'll find he does not tell me that." Jeffrey came out of the back office because Sandra had finally walked over and knocked on the door and said, "I think something's happening out front." He came out, took one look at the situation. Delvecchio with his hand on Otis's arm, the guests standing and watching, the spilled coffee still pooled near the elevator bank, and he made the face of a man whose Tuesday had just gotten very complicated. "What's going on here?" he said. "This gentleman." Delvecchio started. "I have a 9 o'clock with Mr. Harrington," Otis said. Jeffrey blinked. "I'm sorry." "Wallace Harrington," Otis said. "The general manager, 9 o'clock, conference room B." There was a very specific kind of silence that followed. It was the silence of a room recalibrating. Jeffrey pulled out his phone. He stepped to the side. He made a call. He kept his back to the room, and the conversation lasted less than 90 seconds. And when he turned around, his face had changed in a way that was difficult to describe, except to say that it had gotten smaller somehow. He looked at Delvecchio. He looked at Otis. He looked at the guests, still standing near the elevator. "Mr. Beauford," he said, "I am so sorry to have kept you waiting. Can I take you upstairs?" Wallace Harrington had been general manager of the Caldwell Grand for 9 years. He was 51, a big man with close-cropped silver hair, and the handshake of someone who knew that first impressions lived in the hands. He had grown up in Columbus, gone to school on an academic scholarship, worked his way through hospitality management the long way, not through family connections or a lucky break, but through 14-hour days and a willingness to learn every job in every building before he'd let himself run one. He was also, as it happened, Otis Beauford's former student. Otis had taught economics at Morehouse College for 31 years. He had retired 2 years ago. He had been Wallace Harrington's professor in 1995 and 1996, 2 semesters that Harrington had described, in every speech he'd given about his career, as the turning point. The semesters where he'd learned that business wasn't about numbers first, it was about people first, and then the numbers followed. He had invited Otis to the hotel because he was trying to establish a scholarship fund for hospitality students, and he wanted Otis involved in designing the selection criteria. That was what the meeting was for. It was one of 4 meetings Harrington had that day, and the one he'd been most looking forward to. When Jeffrey called upstairs and said there was a situation in the lobby involving a Mr. Beauford, Harrington had come downstairs himself. He had not sent an assistant. He had not called back to ask for clarification. He'd taken the elevator down, walked across the lobby, and found Otis Beauford standing near the elevator bank with a torn paper bag and coffee on his cardigan, and his hands folded in front of him, with the particular dignity of a man who has decided not to spend his energy on being angry. Harrington had stopped walking when he saw him. He had looked at the spilled coffee, at the torn bag, at the way Otis was holding himself, not broken, not diminished, but contained, the way a person gets when they've been containing things for a long time. "Otis," he said. "Wallace," Otis said. There was nothing else said for a moment. Then Harrington turned to Delvecchio and said, in a voice that was quiet and completely level, "This man taught me everything I know about running a business. He is my guest. He has a standing invitation in this building whenever he wants one." He paused. "Would you like to explain to me what happened?" Delvecchio explained. "He used words like protocol and suspicious, and I was just following procedure, and each word landed differently than he intended, because standing next to the general manager of the hotel, a man who was visibly not angry but something worse, something steady and cold and considering, the protocol sounded thin. The procedure sounded like a wrapper around something else. He said he had no way of knowing. Harrington said, "You had a way of knowing. You could have asked." Delvecchio said he had asked. Harrington said, "You asked him to prove himself to you. That's different from asking." It was the kind of distinction that takes a classroom to teach, and Otis, standing slightly to the side, said nothing. He let it sit. What happened in the days after was, in some ways, exactly what you'd expect, and in other ways, not. The security firm was contacted. A formal complaint was filed. The footage from the lobby cameras, there were 4 angles, and all 4 were unambiguous, was reviewed. Delvecchio was removed from the Caldwell Grand assignment while the firm conducted its internal review. What was less expected was what came out of that review. Delvecchio had 3 prior documented complaints from the same firm. One at the mall in Marietta, a black teenager accused of shoplifting, who turned out to be the store owner's nephew, and had been shopping twice a week for 2 years. One at the parking structure, a Hispanic man in his 50s questioned about his vehicle, which turned out to be registered to him, paid off, worth more than Delvecchio's annual salary. And now this. 3 incidents, 3 files, all 3 reviewed, documented, and kept on record. And Delvecchio had continued working. That was the part that Wallace Harrington talked about afterward. Not just the incident with Otis. The 3 complaints that had been sitting in a file somewhere, doing nothing, while Delvecchio went from building to building. "The question isn't only what he did," Harrington said, in an interview he gave to the Atlanta Journal-Constitution 3 weeks after the incident. "The question is what the system did with the information it already had." Otis Beauford, for his part, did not give interviews. He had been asked. A local news station reached out through the college. A podcast that covered civil rights cases in the South sent 2 emails. A woman from a community advocacy group wanted him to speak at a town hall about racial profiling in private security. He thanked each of them and declined. He was not, he told a friend over the phone, interested in being the face of something. He was 63 years old. He had 31 years of students who were out in the world building things, and that was already a face. That was already more than enough. What he did do, the one thing, was write a letter. He wrote it by hand on paper, the way he wrote everything. It was addressed to Sandra Pruitt, the front desk associate who had watched the whole thing happen and had picked up the phone and put it down and picked it up again. He did not know her name when he wrote the letter. He asked Harrington for it. The letter was 4 paragraphs. It did not say she should have done something differently. It did not say she had failed him. It said instead that it was hard to know what to do when you're 6 weeks into a job, and the system around you is telling you one thing and your gut is telling you another, and that he hoped she would remember that the gut, in his experience, was the more reliable instrument. He told her that he'd had students for 31 years, and the ones who learned to trust the feeling that something was wrong and act on it, even when acting was uncomfortable, were the ones he was most proud of. He signed it Professor Otis Beauford, then, underneath, in parentheses, retired, but still paying attention. Sandra Pruitt kept the letter in her locker at work. She showed it to her mother. She has not, as of this writing, quit her job. She has, according to people who work with her, started speaking up a little more in team meetings. The scholarship fund was established. Harrington and Otis had 3 more meetings after the one in Conference Room B, and by the end of the 3rd, they had a structure, 2 awards per year, for students at Atlanta area HBCUs pursuing hospitality management, with preference given to first-generation college students. The selection criteria included academic performance, but also, at Otis's insistence, what he called a demonstrated willingness to ask hard questions in rooms where nobody else is asking them. The application had one required essay prompt. It read, "Describe a moment when you knew something was wrong and had to decide whether to say so." Delvecchio was terminated from the security firm 4 months after the incident. The termination came after a 4th complaint, unrelated to the Caldwell Grand, at a different property. That was similar enough to the first 3 that the pattern became, finally, impossible to keep in a file. He contested the termination. He said he had always followed protocol. He said nobody had ever told him his approach was a problem. That last part, at least, was partially true. Someone had put 3 complaints in a file. Nobody had sat down with him and explained what those complaints meant, or what they revealed, or what would need to change. In some version of this story, Del Vecchio is also a product of a system that collected information and then did nothing with it. That doesn't make what he did to Otis Beauford acceptable. But it does make the question harder. It does mean that firing Del Vecchio, while probably the right conclusion, was not the whole answer. Harrington said as much, publicly. "One person loses a job," he said, "and we feel like the problem has been addressed. But the problem isn't one person. The problem is that 3 complaints existed and they weren't treated as a pattern. The problem is that nobody was trained to look at 3 complaints and say, wait, what is this telling us?" Otis Beauford went back to the Caldwell Grand Hotel 4 months after the incident. He was meeting Harrington for lunch. They had developed a habit of it, once a month, at the restaurant off the main lobby that did a good shrimp and grits, and kept the lighting low enough that you could have an actual conversation. He walked through the same revolving door. He crossed the same marble floor. He stopped at the same spot where his coffee had spilled and his knees had hit the ground, and he stood there for a moment. A bellhop passed him with a cart. A couple checked in at the front desk. The elevator opened, and 3 people in business clothes stepped out talking about something that seemed urgent. Nobody looked at Otis Beauford twice. He walked to the restaurant. He sat down. He ordered coffee, in a real cup this time, with a saucer, the way a hotel restaurant brings it, and he waited for his former student, who arrived 4 minutes later slightly out of breath, apologizing for the elevator taking forever. "It's fine," Otis said. "I had time to think." "About what?" Harrington said, settling into his seat. Otis looked at the lobby through the glass partition, at the revolving door, at the marble floor that had been cleaned so thoroughly there was no sign of anything that had happened there. "About what you have to carry," he said, "when the system finally works for you because of who you know, and what that means for everybody it doesn't work for." Harrington didn't say anything for a moment. Then he said, "That's the question, isn't it?" "That's the question," Otis said. The coffee came. They talked for 2 hours. Outside, the city moved the way cities do, indifferent to any particular injustice, relentless and ongoing, full of people waiting outside revolving doors for meetings they should have been welcomed to from the beginning. The scholarship applications were due in 6 weeks. Already, 43 students had submitted the essay about the moment they knew something was wrong and had to decide whether to say so. Otis had read every single one.